On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Atul Tulshibagwale. He is the CTO of Signal. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic that I haven't covered before, and it's about open standards and why engineers should pay attention and participate. Atul's got a deep background in this area. We're going to talk about, why standards, and why you should care about them. What are they? How you can get involved. We're going to talk about how he developed the standard, and he's going to walk us through that. And I'm excited to have you on, Atul. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, two things before we dive in. Let everyone know what Signal does. And I know your title's a CTO, but obviously you might wear the hat differently. Let us know what some of those responsibilities are before we dive into the episode.
So Signal is a very new company. We are just about a year old. We are working in this area of access management. So what that means is once you have been authenticated by your employer, what are the things that you could do? And this becomes a really complicated question when you think about the sort of the zero trust way of doing things where, you're logged into all kinds of cloud services and, nothing is in one place as such. And so what Signal does is it offers a just-in-time access management solution. So what that does is instead of having static privileges, or maybe in addition to having static privileges, like your role, in your company and all that, we are able to build a sort of a graph of your current enterprise activity. And then based on that graph, you can write human readable policies, which then you can enforce at the time of access. So you can say things like a user who belongs in the customer service department may access a particular customer's data only if they're assigned to a case that is currently open, which relates to that customer. And so that way you can dynamically alter these access permissions as the enterprise activity changes, right? So that's kind of, and then obviously all this is audited and, you can get very good compliance reports and all that. So that's what Signal is.
Very cool. And I know you're the CTO. I mean, what are some of the hats you wear there?
Yeah, so my role is a little bit detached from the day-to-day sort of product development of the company. I provide sort of a high-level product development, product management kind of guidance, but I mainly focus on the sort of the external representation of the company technically, and then also I am very active in the standards body, so that's a big part of my job. And we think that standards are critical to Signal's success. And so from that point of view, I'm active in both the OpenID Foundations and the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF.
Awesome, man. I like it. I think this is a great topic. I mean, it's in your wheelhouse. And I think it's interesting because, obviously engineers deal with different varying standards, whether they are aware of it or not. And you mentioned when we were talking earlier before the show, we talked about why engineers should pay attention to it. And I guess before we dive in, let's actually start at the real top, just to set the stage for everyone, and talk about what open standards are, and maybe use that as a jumping off point.
So open standards are a way in which everyone in the industry agrees that, this is how we are going to communicate with each other, or we're going to interoperate with each other. And, that could be something like the USB standard that we all use, or it could be something very specific to an area like, you do SAML for single sign-on, which is a very common way of doing things. These are standards. Now, the open part of it comes from the standards body being sort of a body that is open for all. It has specific governing policies. It has a governing board and rules that do not prevent people from contributing, from influencing the standard. And, it has generally a democratic, consensus-based sort of approach to evolving a standard. So that's what open standards are.
Awesome. And I guess when I think about that, I kind of think about, well, the open standards are defined for me, and I use them. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned USB. User would never think about it. I'm not an engineer, but I'd never think about how do I get involved. But and I know you're very deeply involved in standards and whatnot. But like when from the outside looking in, if you're an engineer and you're like, well, it's an interesting area. Getting involved seems interesting, but I don't have the time commitment. Like, how does that look? And we're assuming someone who's never been involved in open standards development or contribution of any kind.
Yeah. So, certain areas may be more demanding of open standards than others. But you could analyze in your area whether it makes sense for something to be done in a way that everybody can interoperate with each other, no matter who the vendor is. Like when you buy a USB device, like the speaker and the microphone I'm speaking on, it is coming from a completely different vendor than the monitor it connects to, and then that is a different vendor than the computer that it's connecting to, right? So it's all this works only because of the open standards. And in your area of work, when as an engineer you're working on something, you got to ask the question whether it makes sense for this to be an open standard, because hey, this is not something that we derive a business advantage from, but it is actually something that can enable a market where we can provide a very good service or product. Right? So that could be a good way to figure out if what you're doing is something that can benefit from open standards.
I'm just kind of curious because it's interesting. You're right. Like if you're observing a phenomena that might actually, extend past your company and actually benefits the market, that's one thing to maybe see that, but to take the next step to actually go, hey, you know what? I'm going to actually do X, Y, Z to see if this is viable. Like, because we all have ideas, which is which is great, but then it's the next step of how do you actually go, hey, I think this might work, and extend that into, just maybe it's a false positive. It's like, hey, it isn't exactly something that everyone else needs, but if you don't explore it, you'd never get there. Like, if you do observe something like this, what are some steps to even consider that you should, talk to others, think about open standards?
Yeah, so I think we do have those situations come along, often, and there's some work that I'm doing in the IETF right now that's clearly in that sort of area where we believe there's a need for security of authentication, authorization information at the microservices level, right? So once you have somebody calling your API, and then there's a whole call chain that gets created inside your virtual private cloud, and then that communication is often sort of not secured in the sense that a service may decide to impersonate a user that is not actually the user who's making the API call, or they may use a privilege that is not expected out of that call that comes in, right? And so that kind of security doesn't exist right now, at least as a standard. I know certain companies have that internally, and the thing that we are trying to do right now is, hey, does it make sense for these to be a standard? Because every company out there is going to have a multi-cloud deployment, so that they're going to have something in AWS, they're going to have something in Google Cloud and Azure. How do these services communicate with each other in a standardized sort of way, so that you don't have to roll your own sort of security? Every company doesn't have to roll their own security, essentially. And it kind of moves the industry forward. Now, how we went about doing this is we observed the problem, that this seems to be a problem, and we were convinced that this needs work. We kind of published a blog post on our own website that, hey, this is why we think this problem needs to be solved. And then we had independent conversations with some of the other key players in the industry. And then we sort of formed an informal working group of like, hey, all of us believe that this problem needs to be solved in a standards, open standards kind of way. And then we came up with a charter, right? That a charter document that this is the problem that we are going to solve. What are the goals? what are the non-goals, how are we going to go about building the standard and all that. And then we have currently sort of presented it to the IETF as, be a part of the OAuth working group within the IETF. And we've got support from that group to be a part of that. And so this is how we've come up with a completely new sort of way of doing things, just from nothing, effectively. And this process so far has taken I would say about 6 months. So I think it'll still be a long time before we actually have a draft standard that people can start implementing to. But we are making good progress. At least the industry mindshare is there. And once you start talking, you have people come up to you and say, "Hey, our customers are asking for this, and they expect us to provide this capability." And it's great that we're working on this because now we can have an offering that is standards based.
That's kind of great to walk through. And I was just thinking, as I was listening to you, I was going, man, seems like it would be is to get others to listen, because you might actually be, you might have stumbled on something that could help a lot of people. But obviously, when you're small, you don't have brand, no one knows who you are. People, are always seemingly skeptical of all these ideas that everyone always has, and getting somebody to buy in is a challenge. So building that followership or getting that next person to buy into the vision, I mean, how does that work? Just because I know you've gone through this, I'm just kind of curious what you've seen work or not work from that standpoint.
Yeah, so that is a very good question. And sometimes there are industry driving factors, right? So long ago, when I was involved in this development of the standard called the Liberty Alliance standard, right? This was driven by a fear in the industry that Microsoft is going to release a proprietary way of doing things, doing single sign-on, which was at that time, I think, called Microsoft Passport. And, the whole industry kind of rallied behind good ideas that could actually, create a sort of a non-centralized way of doing single sign-on. And that's how the Liberty Alliance project was born. So there was a driving factor in the industry, which was the fear that one vendor might sort of, dominate the market and cut everyone else out, right? That's one thing. The other possibility is that, back when I was at Google, I worked on this thing called the Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, or CAEP. And we put out a blog in Google with the ideas that, hey, this is something that we can potentially do to solve some of the problems we see in the industry, right? The zero trust and all that, the zero trust architecture. And the response to that blog was enormous. Like, I was getting emails every day, and we had an informal meeting in Google. We thought, 5 or 10 people might attend. We had 30 people fly from all over the world to attend that meeting at Google. Now, obviously, there's a portion of this which is, it was Google, and therefore, maybe there was some benefit to doing that. But of course, there is also this thing that the problem that we were talking about was very relevant, right? And now this fine-grained transactional authorization stuff that I'm working on now in the IETF is actually an effort that we started in Signal, which is a very small company. But still, because the problem is so relevant to everyone in the industry, we are getting interest from both big and small companies, right? So some of the biggest companies in the world, as well as maybe some of the smallest ones, are all involved in the development of the standard. So I think building the followership, I would say, requires a strong need in the industry. It helps to have some credibility in the area of work, because even though, let's say, I'm not at Google anymore, I have the heritage of having worked on the SAML standard and the CAEP standard behind me. And so that gives a little bit of credibility to this process. But I think, finally, if you're talking the right things, if you get the right people in the industry to listen, then you can build that followership.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think as you kind of listen to some of that, and you're thinking, if I was sitting there and I was thinking, how would I start? I think it's like any community, you have to put the IP and content out there. You have to get out there, network, talk to people. It's a little bit of that sales process where you have to get people to buy in. I mean, you have to sell people on your idea. Obviously, coming from Google and the two standards you've worked on, that gives you some of that built-in social proof. Your next idea or your next standard, people are more willing to listen. But I think when you're starting out, let's just say, or you want to participate, maybe even join an existing project so people get to know you, right? Like, I'm just kind of thinking, like, if I'm listening to the podcast and I'm like, hey, this sounds interesting. I see these things happen all the time. Not all the time, but I see things happen. I'd like to be involved. Is joining an existing project similar to, I guess, how is that? Because I'm assuming there's, when we talk about standards, there's maybe a more formal process. People might be used to jumping onto projects on, GitHub or being involved in, projects like that. How different or how similar is joining an open standards project?
So I think it's actually quite similar to maybe joining an open source project where you're making some submissions to the GitHub, repository, and then people are reviewing it and deciding whether that needs to be folded into the main sort of code. Standards bodies are very similar, and so you can find the area of your work in a standards body that is open. And allows participation from everyone, right? And so, like, for example, if you wanted to join the IETF, you can do so as an individual member, right? You don't have to have a company affiliation, even, right? And there are, in the IETF, there are people working on, very important standards that actually don't have a very big company backing or anything like that. They are, sort of small companies or even individuals who are contributing to that standard. And so you can do that, right? So you can join these standards bodies. You can participate in the mailing lists. Sometimes to participate in the mailing list, you may not even need to pay anything to to be a member of that standards body. But as an individual or as a small company, typically the open standards body won't charge you, anything that would really cause you a lot of pain. So, I think it's very easy to get to participate in any of these standards bodies. The thing that you need to be aware of is that there are intellectual property rules of following this. So you can't put something in, for example, the IETF list and then say, that's my patented idea, right? Because it's something by way of sending that email or saying that in an IETF meeting, you're actually you're giving that intellectual property up essentially to the standards body. And, which is why the openness of that standards body is important. It doesn't mean you're giving it to some other vendor. You're just giving it for the whole, the common good at that point.
And now that you mentioned it, I'm like, well, that's obvious. Until you mentioned it, I hadn't even thought about that implication. But that's good to know. If somebody is going to, create an open standard, they need to maybe realize that's not going to be the idea they can patent and make a fortune on. It's to actually improve the betterment of the community. I guess you kind of mentioned a few standards you've worked on and some initiatives that you have. Do you know of any good resources, and I maybe could link to them as well, for people to kind of start looking at some of these concepts of open standards? Is there some place we could direct people?
Sure. The IETF is a great sort of very broad standards body. We recently had the IETF meeting in London that had, I think, 700 or 800 attendees, and it covers, areas like, even sort of modulation of signals on the wire, like analog signals, to all the way down to like, number formats and whatnot, right? So it's a very broad body, and I think that would be a very good place for the audience to look at standards that may be of interest to them. There are specific bodies, like in the identity space, there is the OpenID Foundation that I'm also active in, where you can actually participate in. Let's say there is a standard about financial API, right? So this is how financial services can exchange data about users in a privacy sensitive, secure fashion. And so these kinds of standards are being developed in the OpenID Foundation. So it's all about the identity of the user, right? I would think of those as two good starting points. So IETF.org and OpenID.net are the two sort of standards bodies that I would recommend.
I think it's so broad, and I think based on what you've mentioned, I think if somebody starts looking for their area of interest, it seems like there's going to be an open standards body that probably is related to, this is identity based, but I could imagine there's tons of areas that maybe we all overlook that you could participate in.
Yeah, like for example, I think in the Internet of Things space, I've heard of a standard being developed right now called Matter, which is going to make it much easier for you to have different Internet of Things devices in your home or in your office, right? Right now, if you buy a doorbell from one company, you pretty much have to use their own app, and it doesn't work very well with anything else, and those kinds of things. All that's going to go away with the development of the standard called Matter. So there are standards bodies like that, which are specific to different areas, and you can always find them.
I think a super interesting episode. I mean, I knew about open standards, but I didn't know about the involvement and kind of some of the different, I guess, nuances to it. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing. I guess I like to ask all my guests this question, and it is: if you could have a future guest talk about a topic or answer a single question, whichever you prefer, what would you like to hear about?
Obviously, my gut is to sort of be able to talk more about improving the security of systems. I think there is a crisis that is happening right now, which is due to numerous kinds of ways of subverting systems. People are starting to lose faith and trust in systems, and I would like to bring on a guest who's sort of leading the charge in making things more secure, and I think that would be a great topic to cover.
Awesome. If somebody wants to reach out to you and talk about anything you've mentioned, they might have questions about being involved in open standards or maybe one of the standards you've created. What is a good way of reaching out to you?
So I'm very active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Zero Trust, ZIRO Trust. And then I'm also active on LinkedIn. So those are two, public avenues. Or you could just send me email at atul@signal.ai, SGNL.ai.
Okay. We will make sure to put some of those handles in our show notes and make sure everyone has access to that. But Atul, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing. I think super informative, and I appreciate all your insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was an enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. That's it for this episode. Back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I'd love to get more people talking about improving the security of systems, improving. That is a growing problem. Anyone that's actually putting in fixes to solutions, love to hear about it. So if you are involved in that space, reach out. Love to have you on. Secondly, if you enjoy the podcast, share it with somebody else. Open standards is a pretty interesting area. Could be good for others to hear about. And drop a rating in whatever platform you're listening to this podcast. That's how we've been growing organically. So can't thank you all for doing that enough. That's it. I'll see you guys next time. Thank you and goodbye.